Welcome to Teaching Truth on His Majesty's service. That's the theme for our reflections as we dive into and swim around the exciting, challenging and hugely relevant and prophetic book of Daniel. And Daniel was indeed a man who was on His Majesty's service, on the service of God, none more so when it came to interpreting the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had that we read of in Daniel chapter 2. If you have your Bible, I again invite you, if you will, to open it at Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to read 3 verses today from verses 14 to 16. Let's discover the next part of the story. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. The decree that King Nebuchadnezzar had made had to be obeyed. So Arioch, who was the captain of the king's guard and the chief executioner, was commissioned to round up all the king's wise men and to have them killed. And that included Daniel and his friends. Satan had lost, as it were, one battle. All the other wise men had been killed, but now he was trying to clinch victory from the jaws of defeat, as it were, by having Daniel and his 3 friends killed. But here we see the intervention of God through Daniel to accomplish his purposes and for the blessing of his people. So when Arioch came to get Daniel and his friends, they were shocked to hear of the decree that the king had made. And as the new boys, as it were, among the royal councillors, they hadn't been invited to this original session that King Nebuchadnezzar had called about the dream. And so Daniel spoke to Arioch, note this, with wisdom and tact. With wisdom and tact. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But simply to say that their gracious actions and words during their 3 years of training were the foundation that was now going to help save their lives. And Arioch, in a sense, risked his own life and his own reputation by allowing Daniel time and space to speak to King Nebuchadnezzar. And if you were King Nebuchadnezzar, you would have been surprised to see Daniel, because you would have expected Daniel and his 3 friends, part of the wise counselor group, to have been killed. But apparently, by the grace and the mercy and perhaps the intervention of God in his mind, King Nebuchadnezzar's rage had subsided and he was willing to hear Daniel out. After all, Daniel hadn't been at the original meeting, and so he deserved an opportunity to speak to the king and to obey the king's orders to interpret the dream. Why kill your 4 best counsellors just because of the incompetence of the others? And by faith, and with tact and wisdom, Daniel promised to show the king his dream and the interpretation. Why did he do that? Well, because Daniel was a man of faith. He was a man on His Majesty's service. A man, because of that he knew the Lord would answer prayer. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Daniel dealt with the situation in a godly manner. Daniel did not get angry and take it out on the official. Daniel did not overreact. Daniel had a plan, and it was God's plan. And part of that plan was firstly to ask the questions that needed to be answered. He found out from a reliable source what the problem was. He spoke to Arioch to find out what was happening. He gathered information. And secondly, Daniel asked for time. Daniel knew he needed time to go before God in prayer. He wasn't going to go and see King Nebuchadnezzar and at that moment interpret the dream. And he was confident enough that he would not only get the time he needed from the king, but also the answer he needed from the Lord. And therein lies a lesson for us that too often our first reaction cannot be the wise nor the best reaction. Daniel reacted, or rather acted, in a calm, methodical, and above all, godly manner. And we need, like Daniel, to cultivate that calm, wise, tactful, godly approach in order to deal with situations, emergencies, challenges that come before us. I believe it was due to a lifetime of dedication up to this point that Daniel had, that God enabled Daniel to deal with the current crisis in such a calm, methodical, and godly way. The king showed favour to Daniel. God was at work through King Nebuchadnezzar in his mind, because God's plan was trumping the plan that the evil one had. God had a plan and a purpose for Daniel, and that plan and purpose was to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, a hugely significant dream. Join me again tomorrow in Teaching Truth as we look at the praise which Daniel offered.